In the summer of 1793, inside a stone tower in the middle of Paris, guards pull an 8-year-old boy out of his sister's arms. She is 14 years old. For weeks, she will hear him scream through the wall of the room next to hers. Then, one day, the screaming stops, and no one tells her why. Her name is Marie-Thérèse Charlotte of France, the eldest child of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. By the time she walks out of that tower, she will be the only member of her immediate family still alive. This is the tragic life of Madame Royale. Marie-Thérèse is born at the Palace of Versailles on December 19, 1778, the first child of her parents after 8 years of marriage. The birth nearly kills her mother. The room is so crowded with courtiers watching the delivery, as custom requires for a birth in the French royal family, that Marie Antoinette loses consciousness from lack of air, and servants have to break open windows that had been sealed shut for winter to revive her. When she recovers, the queen looks at her newborn daughter and tells her, in effect, that she is not the son the country wanted, but that she is loved regardless. The court gives the girl the title Madame Royale, reserved for the eldest daughter of a reigning French king, and her mother nicknames her Mousseline la Sérieuse for the grave, careful way she carries herself even as a small child. Louis XVI adores his daughter without reservation and indulges her. Marie Antoinette takes a different approach. Raised in the strict court of Vienna, she is determined that her daughter learn discipline, self-control, and the bearing of a queen, and she personally oversees a program of religious instruction, etiquette, and restraint. Marie-Thérèse grows up inside this contradiction, adored by one parent and drilled by the other, and the composure her mother demands of her becomes the single trait that will define the rest of her life. She is not raised alone. A younger sister, Sophie, dies in 1787, before her first birthday. A younger brother, Louis-Joseph, the heir to the throne, dies of tuberculosis in June 1789 at age 7, in the middle of the political crisis that will trigger the French Revolution. A second brother, Louis-Charles, 3 years younger than Marie-Thérèse, is now next in line to the throne. Weeks after her brother's death, a Paris mob storms the Bastille prison. 3 months later, on October the 5th, 1789, thousands of armed men and women march on Versailles itself. The royal family barricades itself inside the king's apartments while the crowd forces its way through the palace outside. Marie-Thérèse, 10 years old, later remembers seeing the severed heads of 2 of her father's bodyguards carried on pikes beneath the windows. Her mother later says she is old enough to remember these scenes for the rest of her life. The crowd forces the family to relocate to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, where they live from now on under constant watch. It is, in practice, their first prison, though no one calls it that yet. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the family attempts to escape France. Marie-Thérèse and her younger brother are dressed as girls and presented as the children of a Russian noblewoman, a role played by their own governess. The queen and king pose as servants. The disguise holds for most of the journey east, but in the town of Varennes, close to the border, a local official recognizes the king and the family is stopped. Thousands of armed guards and townspeople escort the coach back to Paris. For most of the return journey, 12-year-old Marie-Thérèse has no seat of her own inside the crowded carriage and takes turns sitting on her aunt's lap and her governess's lap to make room for the revolutionary officials assigned to guard the family. The failed escape convinces much of France that the monarchy cannot be trusted, and it marks the beginning of the end for the family's freedom. On August 10, 1792, a crowd storms the Tuileries Palace. Marie-Thérèse and her brother hide in a small council chamber while a massacre unfolds in the gardens outside. Within days, the family is arrested and moved to the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris built centuries earlier by the Knights Templar. Marie Antoinette had once asked her brother-in-law to have the tower demolished, saying the sight of it had always horrified her. Now it is her prison. 6 weeks later, France abolishes the monarchy and declares itself a republic. The family loses its titles overnight and is registered under a single ordinary surname, Capet. Inside the temple's main tower, the king and his son are housed on one floor, and the queen, Marie-Thérèse, and her aunt, Madame Elisabeth, are housed on the floor above, directly over the king's rooms. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI is taken from the tower, tried, and executed. For the rest of her life, Marie-Thérèse holds 2 days of prayer every January to mark the anniversary of her father's death. The family's remaining time together is short. On July 3, 1793, guards enter the women's quarters and forcibly remove 8-year-old Louis Charles, now the uncrowned Louis XVII in the eyes of royalists, and place him in a separate room under the care of a shoemaker and his wife, who dress him as a commoner's child and mistreat him. Marie Antoinette can sometimes see her son through a crack in the wall, and watching for these glimpses becomes, by her daughter's own account, almost all her mother thinks about. 1 month later, on the night of August 2nd, 1793, guards come for the Queen herself and take her to a separate prison to await trial. Marie-Thérèse is not told where her mother has gone. She asks the guards for news of her constantly. They refuse to answer. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette is executed. Her daughter is not informed. She continues asking after her mother for months, unaware that she is already dead. Only her Aunt Elizabeth remains with her now. Before her own arrest, Elizabeth had warned her niece never to let the guards find her undressed or asleep in bed, since they could enter the room at any hour of the night. So Marie-Thérèse begins sitting upright in a chair through the night instead of lying down. On May 9, 1794, guards take Madame Elisabeth away. They tell Marie-Thérèse her aunt has gone out to take some air. Elizabeth is executed the following morning. Marie-Thérèse, 15 years old, is now completely alone in the tower, the only member of the royal family still imprisoned inside it and, though she does not yet know it, the only one still alive. For more than a year, she remains in solitary confinement. She is given 2 books, a prayer manual called The Imitation of Christ and a travel account by La Harpe, and reads them so many times that she can recite long passages from memory. Her requests for more books, for information, for any contact with the world outside her room are denied. At some point during this period, she scratches a message into the wall of her cell, in her own hand, that she is the unhappiest person in the world, that she can get no news of her mother despite asking 1,000 times, that she begs her dead father to watch over her from heaven. She can still hear her brother's voice through the tower wall, his cries when he is beaten, until June 8, 1795, when the sound stops and does not return. She has no way of knowing that he has died of tuberculosis in the room below her, after nearly 2 years of isolation and mistreatment. Weeks later, the government finally assigns her a companion, a woman named Renée de Chantereine, and it is through her that Marie-Thérèse learns, in stages, what has happened to her family. She has already suspected her father is dead. She now learns her mother has been dead for almost 2 years, and that her brother is gone as well. She is the last one left. By this point, French authorities are already negotiating her release, and visitors who see her in these final weeks of captivity describe a startling change. The delicate, frail girl who entered the temple as a young teenager has become, in one witness's words, tall, strong, and marked by an unmistakable air of gravity. 3 years of imprisonment have altered her appearance as much as her circumstances. On December 18, 1795, at 11 at night, the evening before her 17th birthday, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte walks out of the temple. She has been imprisoned for 3 years, 4 months, and 5 days. She is exchanged for a group of French prisoners held in Austria and escorted under guard toward the border, arriving in Vienna the following January. Her Austrian relatives receive her politely, but many of them barely know her, and in the years that follow, she is treated less like a girl who has just survived a prison sentence that killed the rest of her family, and more like a valuable unmarried princess whose marriage can be used to secure alliances. Her father's brother, who now calls himself King Louis XVIII, though he rules nothing, has no children of his own and needs the Bourbon line to continue. He arranges Marie-Thérèse's marriage to her first cousin, Louis-Antoine, Duke of Angoulême, the son of his younger brother. Louis-Antoine is timid and stammers when he speaks. One supporter of the family privately describes him as small, plain, and slow. The wedding takes place on June 10, 1799 at Mitau Palace, in what is now Latvia. The marriage lasts the rest of both their lives and never produces a child who survives infancy. For the next 15 years, the couple lives as part of a royal court with no country, moving from residence to residence across Europe, while Napoleon Bonaparte consolidates power in France, crowns himself emperor in 1804, and redraws the borders of the continent through a series of military campaigns. The family eventually settles at Hartwell House in the English countryside, where Louis XVIII maintains something resembling a royal household in exile, and where Marie-Thérèse, still in her 30s, has already outlived every other member of her immediate childhood family by 2 decades. Napoleon is finally defeated in the spring of 1814. He abdicates on the 6th of April, and the French Senate invites the Bourbons back. Marie-Thérèse lands at Calais on the 24th of April to cheering crowds who have waited a generation to see a child of Louis XVI in France again. She reaches Paris in early May. When she catches sight of the Tuileries Palace, the site of the attack that began her family's imprisonment 22 years earlier, she faints. It is not an isolated moment. For the rest of her life, large crowds can trigger fainting spells and visible distress, and she goes out of her way to have her carriage avoid driving past the site where the guillotine once stood. In January 1815, on the anniversary of her father's execution, the remains of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are formally reburied with state honors. For the first time in over 20 years, her family's position in France appears secure. Her return also comes with an unusual burden. Because no one outside his guards ever witnessed her brother's death in the temple, dozens of men across Europe come forward in the years following the revolution claiming to be Louis XVII, insisting the real prince escaped and a substitute child died in his place. Marie-Thérèse, the one person most likely to recognize her own brother, is repeatedly asked to examine these claims in person. She dismisses every one of them. It does not last. In March 1815, Napoleon escapes his exile on the island of Elba and lands back in France. The troops sent to arrest him join him instead. Louis XVIII flees the country. Marie-Thérèse is in Bordeaux when the news arrives. The same woman who cannot walk past the site of her parents' execution without visible distress now refuses to run from an emperor's army. She appears in public across the city, gives speeches, and publishes a proclamation calling on the citizens of Bordeaux to defend the crown. Local troops agree to protect her personally, but will not fight fellow Frenchmen on her behalf. Napoleon, informed that the king's niece is standing against him in Bordeaux, sends orders for her arrest. She refuses to go, and refuses, in her own words, to be put in irons again. Only when General Clausel convinces her that her presence will bring pointless destruction down on the city does she agree to board an English ship, landing in Plymouth on April 19, 1815. When Napoleon hears how she conducted herself in Bordeaux, he says she is the only man in her family. Marie-Thérèse, for her part, refers to him for the rest of her life only as the usurper and the criminal. Napoleon is defeated for the last time at Waterloo 2 months later, and the Bourbons return to France a second time. For the next decade, Marie-Thérèse serves as the closest thing France has to a first lady. Standing in for the Queen, her uncle never remarried. In 1820, her husband's cousin, the Duke of Berry, is assassinated outside the Paris Opera. His widow gives birth to a son later that same year, a boy royalists call the miracle child and the future of the dynasty. Marie-Thérèse, still without children of her own after more than 20 years of marriage, effectively raises this nephew and his older sister as her own. In 1824, Louis XVIII dies and her father-in-law becomes King Charles X. Marie-Thérèse becomes Dauphine, the wife of the heir to the throne, making her, uniquely in French history, both the daughter of one king and the presumptive future queen married to the son of another. That future lasts 20 minutes. In late July 1830, a new revolution breaks out in Paris. After 3 days of fighting known as the Three Glorious Days, Charles X abdicates on August 2nd in favor of his son, Marie-Thérèse's husband, who becomes, briefly, King Louis XIX. About 20 minutes later, under pressure from advisors who believe a 9-year-old heir will be more acceptable to the public than an adult one, Louis Antoine abdicates as well in favor of his young nephew. For those 20 minutes, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, the girl who once scratched a message of despair into a prison wall, is Queen of France. It changes nothing. The Chamber of Deputies ignores the family's chosen heir entirely and hands the crown instead to a cousin, Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orléans, who takes the throne as a self-declared citizen king. On August 4th, the family leaves Rambouillet Palace for the coast, and on August 16th, they sail from Cherbourg into exile once again. Marie-Thérèse will never set foot in France again. The final exile lasts 21 years and moves across half of Europe. The family lives briefly in England, then in Edinburgh, then from 1833 in Prague. Charles X dies in 1836. Life becomes quieter and more restrained. In 1844, Louis Antoine dies from complications of blood poisoning, ending a marriage of 45 years. Marie-Thérèse, now a widow in her mid-60s with no surviving children, settles at Schloss Frosdorf, a modest estate outside Vienna once occupied for a time by Napoleon's own sister during her own exile. Her nephew, Henri, and niece Louise, whom she has raised since childhood, join her there. She spends her final years walking, gardening, reading, and praying, largely apart from the courts of Europe that once negotiated over her marriage. In 1851, after a long walk, she catches a chill. It develops into pneumonia. She dies at Frosdorf on the 19th of October, 1851, at the age of 72. She is buried beside her husband in the Bourbon family crypt at the Kostanjevica Monastery, now in Slovenia, alongside Charles X and other members of her exiled family. 2 months after her death, Napoleon's nephew, Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, seizes power in France in a coup d'état and later declares himself Emperor Napoleon III. The dynasty Marie-Thérèse spent her entire life defending never returns to the French throne. Even her death does not fully settle the question of who she was. For nearly 2 centuries, a persistent rumor circulated across Europe, claiming that the woman who returned from the temple in 1795 was not the real Marie-Thérèse at all. According to this theory, the trauma of the prison had left the real princess unable to resume public life. And somewhere on the road to Austria, she switched places with a companion, possibly an illegitimate half-sister, who then lived out the rest of the public story in her place. The theory pointed to a real, documented figure, a veiled woman known only as the Dark Countess, who arrived in the small German town of Hildburghausen in 1807 with a secretive companion, lived in near-total seclusion inside a remote castle for 30 years, and was buried in an unmarked grave in 1837 under a false name. Believers pointed to portraits of Marie-Thérèse from before and after her imprisonment that looked strikingly different from one another, and to handwriting that seemed to change as well. Historians never gave the theory much credit, but it persisted for 2 centuries regardless, in books, novels, and later online forums. In 2013, scientists exhumed the Dark Countess's remains and extracted a bone sample for genetic testing, comparing her mitochondrial DNA against a living maternal descendant of Marie Antoinette's family and against the preserved heart of Marie Therese's brother, Louis XVII, which had itself been authenticated years earlier through similar testing. The results, published in 2015, were conclusive. The Dark Countess's DNA matched neither reference. Whoever she was not Marie-Thérèse Charlotte of France. The identity of the real Dark Countess remains unknown to this day, a separate and unrelated mystery. But the woman who spent 3 years alone in a Paris tower, who buried her entire immediate family before the age of 17, who stood in a city and refused to leave when an emperor's army approached it, and who was, for 20 minutes, the uncrowned Queen of France, was exactly who she always said she was.